Good afternoon, Barry.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm all right. It's a little breezy here. That's the way it is springtime in Monticello. How about there?
We're a little bit rainy here.
Oh, okay. Well, let's add to our series on fiscal rules. I was just looking over our completed YouTube videos, which you listeners may wish to access. We've got three already on fiscal rules. I think today we want to talk about President Trump's history on fiscal rules and things that he's been doing recently to make it harder to get our fiscal house in order.
Yes, I think that we started out this year with big hopes that President Trump would be serious about addressing the debt crisis. He has made statements that he wants to address the problem, but as you said, the things that he is doing now, I think, have exacerbated the problem. And I think what we're observing, of course, is the chaos in financial markets that results from his trade policies and his policies attacking Jerome Powell as chairman of the Fed. They have really disrupted financial markets. And so, unfortunately, I think our problem at this point is that we're further behind because these policies have really exacerbated the debt crisis in several ways. Of course, one way is higher interest rates. I mean, the higher interest rates on government debt is significantly increasing the cost of servicing that debt. And I think that that's directly a result of these policies. And of course, the problem of lower growth. I think the most recent estimates of forecasts for economic growth by the IMF and others is a significant reduction of U.S. growth rates, at least for the foreseeable future. So basically, we have slower growth, higher interest rates, which of course means that servicing the debt and just meeting our obligations becomes more and more difficult over time, the more that we pursue these policies. So I think it's sort of a discouraging thing to look back at this 100 days or so of President Trump, but we're at least with respect to the debt, we're in much worse shape.
Yeah, for our listeners, since this goes into YouTube, they should know that today is April 25th, so basically the 100-day point for the Trump administration. So we do hope to be proven wrong on some of these fronts by maybe the light at the end of the tunnel isn't an oncoming train like it seems to be at the moment, that some of these riverboat gamble notions such as trade policy produce freer trade rather than less free trade. But that's totally remains to be determined. And as you said, President Trump has created some unnecessary turmoil by going after certain people like the Fed chair. That I mean, there's no upside to that. His term expires in about a year, and nothing really can be done about it in the meantime. And talking about it only gets us deeper in trouble. And it is important to understand that we are spending 1/5 of our revenue on debt service, and that's going to go up because we have a lot of 10-year Treasury bills at 2 and 3%. When those roll over, they're not going to roll over to 2 or 3%. They're going to roll over into 4, and who knows, by then maybe 5%. So at current interest rates, we're on track to be spending nearly $2 trillion on interest, and that's over a third of our revenue. And certainly a key question to ask you folks watching this is, at what point will you be alarmed by this? In other words, at what degree of having our revenue spent on interest will you be concerned enough to speak up on this? And it is important to speak up because, as our recent series of conversations pointed out, we have to do a whole bunch of things to get our debt crisis in order, not just Doge, not just going after waste, fraud, and abuse, but a bunch of other things, including economic growth. And probably the most important thing is reassuring those bondholders that they're going to be paid back in dollars that buy at least what they're buying now and hopefully more.
Yeah, and I think it's worth repeating some of our earlier discussion. And the question is, how do you address it? We have a debt crisis that's getting worse. what's the solution? How can we address it? And as you say, I think ultimately citizens may have to step up to the plate here. Congress has just rubber stamped essentially everything that Trump has thrown at them so far. And we, of course, would hope that Congress would step up to the plate and say, this is not sustainable. We can't continue accumulating debt at this rate, and enact some statutory law or other law that might constrain this growth in debt. But unfortunately, Congress has had many opportunities to pass legislation, constitutional amendments, statutes to address the problem unsuccessfully. I don't think anything that the Congress has done in the last 2 decades has significantly reduced the growth of debt. And virtually everything they've done so far seems to be exacerbating the problem. So, as we've talked about frequently on these podcasts, when you look around at the countries that have been successful, like Switzerland, citizens step up to the plate. In 2000, the Swiss citizens enacted a fiscal responsibility amendment called the debt brake to their constitution with 85% approval, and that constitutional limit on the growth of debt has worked. I think the Swiss have significantly reduced their debt burdens over the last 2 decades, while ours has gotten worse. So we end up, in my view, with something we've said frequently, and that is that we don't have the initiative and referendum at the federal level. What we have is Article 5. Article 5 says that citizens, as well as Congress, can amend the Constitution. And if Congress can't do it, citizens must step up and use this Article 5 process to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment. And as you know, I think the number of private groups are now working to call a convention under Article 5, and in fact, filing suit against Congress for its failure to call this Article 5 convention. So, I think we repeat this many times in these discussions, but ultimately, I think citizens need to understand that it may be in their hands at this point because the alternatives, the checks and balances of Congress and so forth, just are not working. They don't work. So I hate to be a pessimist. That's what economists are, right?
We're the sleepies when nothing else works. But and George Will said we are sleepwalking into a crisis. So maybe that's the common denominator, is the need to wake up. And as you say, the Congress has a role, even sadly, in the Article 5 process. Namely, they've got to call the convention, and they're not doing it. They're refusing to do it, imposing a huge cost on these private groups that have gotten 34 states to approve the convention on that single issue. And the other thing worth noting, maybe because it's false, so will be corrected, but maybe so President Trump will reconsider through some of the people listening to us. I've heard through back channels that he's opposed to a constitutional amendment to cap spending growth. Again, I hope that that's false, and I would implore him to change his mind. If for no other practical reason, then there's no way that such an amendment could take effect until after his term expires. So it's something that he needs to do to impose limits on his successors. It's not going to impose a limit on him if that's the reason that he is currently opposed. And one of the things that he had as a great idea when he was a candidate back in 2016 was to sell mineral right assets. I have yet to see any outward sign, and maybe that's not important yet. I've yet to see any outward sign that that's in the cards to make some money on that. That depends on the cap on spending growth. Otherwise, Congress will just spend the additional money.
Well, that's discouraging to hear that he is opposed to an Article 5 amendment convention to enact a fiscal responsibility amendment. But let's hope that is something that we can overcome, because that's very discouraging.
Yep. And on that sad note, we'll talk about this again, maybe with better news in a couple of weeks.